Welcome back to the Gen Z Speaks podcast. Before we delve into this week's episode, I wanted to give you guys a quick background slash intro to Paul Niehaus, our guest for today's podcast. Unfortunately, because of internet and Zoom connectivity problems, the intro part of the podcast got cut off when we first initially interviewed Paul Niehaus back in the summer of 2021. And so without further ado, here's a quick introduction on Paul Niehaus. Paul went to Harvard, got his bachelor's from there, and got a PhD in economics from there as well. He started off by co-founding a couple of fintech companies with some of his friends at Harvard, and then transitioned into a career in academics. He currently teaches economics at UC San Diego. And part of the reason why we had him on the podcast was he researches and examines the design, implementation, and impact of anti-poverty programs at really large scales. And one of the solutions that he's been, studying and publishing a lot of papers on is universal basic income, UBI. And he actually co-founded Give Directly, which is a leader in terms of giving payments directly to people. It's an international NGO, and they've given over, I think, $500 million in the last decade alone of unconditional direct digital transfer payments to people in East Africa. And Paul is just a really smart guy who knows what he's talking about and has had a prolific career researching UBI and other things in economics. And so Matt, Jenish, and I really wanted to have him on the podcast and just talk about economics, UBI, and some other things. So we hope you enjoy. And lastly, I know I've been talking a lot, but we will be releasing an episode on our weekly commentary that, like we usually do, in the next 3 or 4 days. Our apologies for the delay. Life's been getting a little busy, but we take full responsibility. We should be, releasing the podcast weekly, but hopefully we will in the next 4 or 5 days. So we hope you enjoy. Paul, thank you so much for coming on, man. We appreciate you.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be here.
Let's dive right in. Obviously, your personal experience and the current roles that you're involved in, from leading and being the chairman at Give Directly, to teaching economics, to being the CEO of 2 fintech companies. My question in general is, what drew you to economics, and why did you decide to take on different roles within your capacity as an academic teacher?
Yeah, fortunately for me, I was not the CEO of the fintech companies that Michael, my co-founder, and I got started. Fortunately for me and for the companies as well, I think. But I did get to play an integral role in getting those up and running, and that was a tremendous experience. So I've always, sort of felt myself at this boundary between thinking and doing. And actually, when I was deciding what to do after college, this to me was the core tension. I was trying to decide whether, I knew I wanted to get into international development work and work on accelerating the end of extreme poverty. I was trying to figure out whether I should go get the PhD and do that and sort of start primarily as a thinker, or go get some operational skills and figure out how to get things done. And, I remember getting some really good advice from, you talk to a bunch of people about these things and, big life decisions, and the reality is nobody knows. But one piece of advice I got that turned out to be very good was from someone who said, it's a lot easier to go from thinking into doing than the other way around. So keep that in mind. And so it's a very simple point about option value, but for me, it's very much played out that way, in the sense that I think being a part of the research community has been wonderful, and it's been an exciting time with the advent of experimental testing. People starting to run randomized controlled trials for the first time, and that was really taking off about the time that I was in grad school. But I've also always felt that when you see something in that research and that evidence that should imply something that should be happening that isn't, that there's then an opportunity to jump in and get your hands dirty and to do that as well. And so that was very much the case with Give Directly. And then Give Directly also led to Segovia and to TapTap. Sort of one problem, one opportunity really begets another as you see the adjacent spaces that need to get filled.
So I think let's dive right into your research. A lot of your recent research focuses on UBI, particularly its impact during the pandemic. Over the course of your research on this particular topic, what have you found that's rather that defies kind of the norms of how people usually conceive of UBI, specifically during these unconventional times?
Yeah, I'd say, a few things. So first, a lot of my recent work has been, some of it has been on cash transfers or things that look like UBI. A lot of it has been on sort of very large scale experiments where, we're not saying what happens to one family when they get some money or one person when they get some money, but like what happens to a community or what happens to a district? How does the entire, shape and structure of the economy change in response to that? And so, I just want to preface everything by saying that because that's really exciting and relatively new that we're able to run experiments at that level and start to see things like, what happens to the economy as a whole. And so I think that's been one of the big lessons from some of these projects that I've been involved in looking at the impacts of cash transfers. To be clear, we're looking at impacts here in sort of fairly rural parts of developing countries, Western Kenya, places like that. So we're going to see things like people getting out of farming and into other occupations that, maybe don't apply to an experiment in San Diego or in LA or someplace like that. But I think that's been one of the big ones that you see these sort of really large impacts on economies. You see people switching into different sectors, different occupations. You see output increasing. And so, some of that is because people are working a bit more. And I suppose for many people, that's one of their core questions about something like UBIs, are people going to stop working? And in, the emerging markets, we actually tend to see the opposite, that if anything, when you give people money, they work a bit more. And I think often that's because there are things they want to do and they lack the capital to do them. And when they have money, they're able to do them. And so, so part of it is because of that, but I think also part of it is because there's just a lot of underutilized capacity in these, rural economies. You have little shops where people sit and they wait for a customer to come by. And when there aren't that many customers, there's not that much business. And when there are more customers, you can do more. And so I think that sort of very simple truth about the way things work has actually been, to me, one of the most prominent things that we've been learning about. Um, I know you asked about during the pandemic specifically. And so, this has been a fairly small slice of what we've done with the Basic Income Project in Kenya. We're looking right now at the big round of data collection that we did, sort of working on the paper, the write-up of that. But we did do this round of data collection during the pandemic. And, of course, that took us by surprise like everybody else. So when we set up this project, we weren't expecting it to be a project about, basic income and pandemics. But we had this opportunity to sort of see how is life different for people that are getting basic income and had been getting it before the pandemic. And, I think there are a few things that are interesting. We look at whether they're better off on sort of basic measures of health and well-being. It seems like they are. We look at whether they're sort of out interacting more, contributing, whether is it impacting social distancing essentially? And it seems like, if anything, they're probably out interacting a bit less. So from a public health perspective, I think those results were important. Those are things that we wanted to share with governments in the countries where we're working. But, to me, probably the biggest picture thing that came out of that side project was, we've seen a bunch of these people create small businesses before the pandemic. And then you see that when the pandemic hits, and especially the lockdowns, right? It's not the virus per se, but it's the restrictions on mobility and business openings. These businesses just totally flatline along with everybody else's business. So the extra money they had been making just goes away. But then what you also see is that there's less of an impact on their food security, their ability to put food on the table and feed their families. And it's not that they're doing well, or that they're sort of not having issues with hunger. They are. But less so than other people. So I think you sort of see a little bit of this idea of UBI as a way of insuring yourself and letting you take some risks, like starting a business and knowing that you'll still be able to put food on the table, even if things go really poorly. It just happened that in this case, it was a much bigger risk than any of us had anticipated we'd end up studying.
Yeah, Paul, that was a lot to dissect there, but kind of getting to the fundamental level, you said you guys did a lot of experiments, and I kind of wanted to ask you about in a traditional, traditional unquote field of science, you see that we have controlled experiments. We have experiments, for example, in like a biology lab with petri dishes and controlled variables, independent variables. How are experiments different in the field of economics? What differences are there with other, contrasting to other fields of science?
Great. Well, first, thanks for that question. And the first thing I'd say is just for folks to be aware that it's a relatively new thing for economists or for social scientists to do experiments at all. And especially in my field of international development, it was really only around 2000 or so that this started to take off. And of course, it was recognized a couple of years ago with the Nobel Prize to Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, Michael Kramer, which is great. But I think a lot of people have the sense that we've been at this problem of international development, global poverty reduction for 60, 70 years, and we've learned a lot. And certainly that's true. There are things we've learned along the way, but we actually didn't start testing our theories of change in a rigorous way until about 20 years ago. And so I think that's important context for people to have. I think a lot of the received wisdom, the things that we thought we knew at that point of time, turned out to be not to be true. And certainly I think one of those was, oh, you can't just give money to people because they're not going to use it in sensible ways. That has very much not turned out to be true, I think, in the experimental data. So, but to get to your technical question, Jenish, I think that in a lot of other hard sciences, there are opportunities to run experiments where you can really control almost everything except for the variable you're interested in. And in economics, that's going to tend to be less so. Sometimes we get a bit more that way where we'll bring people into a lab setting. You may have these opportunities to participate in lab studies on your campus. And, there we'll try to minimize all the variation and all the variables except for the things that we're interested in. But even so, people are different. We don't know that. We're going to assign some person to treatment A and some people to treatment B. And one person may be a risk-loving person, the other person might hate taking risks, and we just don't know that, right? And so we can't control all of those things to the same degree of precision that you could in a physics experiment or a chemistry experiment. And when we get out into the field, we're doing experiments out in the countryside in Kenya or India, places like that, then even more so. There are lots of these other things. And so, what that means is that we can still estimate effects, and kind of identify the average impacts of the things we're studying. But we have to be much more aware, I think, of the context in which we're working and think about, we see these impacts here, but how might the impacts look different in a different place where these other parameters were different?
I want to go back to the concept of UBI, and I think a lot of Americans are more aware of that concept because of the stimulus check payments, and we're more receptive to this idea of a federal government, a centralized source giving us a consistent round of money. But I think a lot of people think that UBI is this new concept, right? That hasn't really existed before, and that's couldn't be farther from the truth, right? I mean, Thomas Paine wrote about the concept of basic income in his book. MLK was a champion of basic income, and a lot of politicians and academic researchers have been looking into UBI itself. You mentioned this in your last comment that the results obviously vary from different experiments in terms of how people use a basic income. In your research, have you you obviously mentioned, and a lot of research has established that people don't just use this money to waste. They actually use it for basic necessities, and this money, even if it's a limited amount of money, it can go a long way. And so, in your different experiments in Kenya and India, have you noticed any similarities between how people use this money? Do most people use this money for basic necessities, or are there any varying outliers in your data so far?
Yeah, there's a real range, and I think that's an important part of the story. And part of the point, right, of giving people money is that not everybody is going to want to do the same thing with it. So, one example that I like is buying livestock. So a lot of people live in sort of rural communities. I'd say a typical thing in a project that Give Directly runs, we might see 30 or 40% of the people spend a meaningful amount of their money on purchasing livestock. And that's an interesting one because you probably know there are a lot of other programs out there that solely do that. They give people livestock and training on how to raise it, and that's sort of their intervention, their focus. And so when I see a number like that, I say, well, on the one hand, it's not crazy to think that giving people livestock could be helpful to them, because clearly a lot of people actually want to do that themselves. But on the other hand, it's not everybody, right? And there are other people for whom the priority is literally just getting food on the table for their kids, paying school fees. There are people that are going to, start some other business, or they're going to rebuild a house because their house is falling apart. And so there's this real richness, and it's really, it's kind of like if you look around yourself, if you look at the people that to see how differently different people spend their money, what their priorities and values are. There's a lot of variety in human nature, and I think you see that in these cash transfer programs, and that's it's, for me as a researcher, what can make them challenging to sum up and describe in a concise way for people. But I think it's part of the point of it.
Yeah, focusing on UBI, do you think there's a long-term impact that's going to I mean, and this is kind of a hard question because you can't predict what's going to happen in the future, but from your intuition, do you think UBI would have any radical disadvantages later down in the future? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, if you think just in terms of the impacts on people who are getting it, we do have some studies now that have looked at, been able to trace out impacts, not just on, the people that receive transfers, but even on their kids. In the US, there's a study of, kids whose moms received pensions back in the 1920s and 1930s, and people were able to follow them and see how much longer they lived, things like that. So, we have some bits and pieces like that where we're able to trace it out. I think that one thing that's exciting about the project that we're running in Kenya right now is that in a sense, we can get a feeling for how the future matters now. And so what I mean by that is we have a group of people, a group of communities where everybody's getting transfers for the next 12 years at a minimum, where we've made that commitment to them. And so they know that, whatever happens, to the extent that they trust us, that money's still going to be there to meet basic needs. We also have an arm where we've only committed to 2 years of transfers. And so what that means is we can look at people after a year and a half, say, and say, here are people, they've received the same amount of money. So in terms of dollars into the pockets, these guys look exactly the same. But the difference is that in one group, they expect the transfers to continue. And we can ask, does that matter, right? Does it matter that you know that it's there in perpetuity? And, by the way, this is important because there are so many of these pilots going on and they're interesting. There are things to be learned from each of them, but by and large, all of these are very short-term pilots, right? Committing to giving people money for a year, 2 years, something like that. And, that's in the nature of a pilot, right? That is short-term. But what that means is we're not really seeing in those pilots the impact of this long-term commitment of somebody knowing, like, I know that for the next decade, right? If I take risks, if something doesn't work out, I'm going to have something to fall back on. And so, sneak preview, we're not publishing the results yet, but the short answer is yes, we're seeing differences between those arms. We're seeing that it does matter, those expectations of the future.
So since there are advocates for not only universal basic income, but UBI in terms of developing nations as well, how would you think the strategy plays out differently from providing countries with that are underdeveloped, because obviously there are basic needs for them, rather than the US or England, in terms of how they would go ahead and spend that money?
Yeah, well, here's the interesting thing, Matt, I think about that question, which is, in some sense, the conversations look very different. You look here in the US, we're concerned about the impacts of AI and automation, and we're concerned that in the future, there may be a lot of job loss and unemployment, underemployment. You go to a lot of developing countries and they're dealing with a lot of unemployment and underemployment right now, right? Sort of young men and women in their 20s and 30s that are just not able to get jobs or not able to get the jobs they thought that would be available to them based on the education they've got. And so, incredible rates of unemployment. And so they're having to rethink social policy on the fly there. So, first and foremost, I think, I don't expect that the impacts, like the numbers we get from our study, are going to be the same everywhere. But I think that there's a great opportunity to look at what's happening in the emerging markets now and the impacts that social reforms like basic income there have, and ask, what can we learn from that for the US in 10 or 20 years from now, if in fact we do start to see some of this automation and these layoffs. So, I think first and foremost, that's how I think about it.
Got it. So I actually have a question, a little off topic, but regarding the cryptocurrency market. So in terms of Ethereum, and we're seeing a lot of things with NFTs right now, and clearly there's extreme potential with it, right? So how would you see it playing out for NFTs to kind of dive into, let's just say, estates or real estate in general, and that type of terminology and documents? Do you think that there's going to be a future aspect for that, where we deal with all this through the Ether blockchain?
Yeah, I mean, here's where there have been points of contact between what we've been doing and that movement, that community. First and foremost, it's been a very generous community from our perspective. A lot of people who have made significant donations of Ethereum or Bitcoin, and that's great. I think that obviously this is kind of a community that loves digital payments and loves to see that happening in the emerging markets as well as the developed ones. And so, we've been really grateful for that, and I think that's been exciting to partner in that way. In terms of the problems that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, I don't think there is yet an obvious use case. Most of the people that we're serving are going to be using some form of digital currency. For some of them, it's going to be for the first time as they're starting to use mobile money, which is what we usually use to send transfers to people. I think it's still more comfortable for them to get the money in shillings or whatever the local currency is. And, that's also the currency in which they spend their money at the local shop for now. And so it makes most sense for them to receive it in that way. So I think that will largely stay the way it is. We move a lot of money across borders at Give Directly and at some of these other companies that have been involved in starting. And so those markets are very opaque, and sometimes the spreads can be quite high. The process can be very slow. It can take days for or even weeks for payments to settle cross borders. And so, that's an area where I could see if sort of volume in some of these cryptocurrencies picks up, that this could become an enabler, for much more competition and much better terms on sort of cross-border payments. And so that's something I think we typically keep an eye on. And then the other thing that's been really striking, right, is to look at some places like Venezuela or Zimbabwe that are experiencing hyperinflation and just, real issues with the sort of fiat government-backed currency where, in spite of the fact that it's obviously a very risky asset, something like Bitcoin actually looks attractive to people as a relatively safe haven. And so, I think that's the other sort of application in the emerging markets that's been pretty compelling that we've seen.
I want to ask you similar, on this. I would say it's a logistic question where, Matt was telling me that Give Directly has basically a 99 to 100% rating in terms of how efficiently you guys distribute funds. And obviously, you've given out, I believe it's 759,000 people direct money. Can you walk us through what that process looks like and how your particular organization has been so successful, right, in directly giving money? And how do you, measure your success in terms of just actually the distribution of that money?
Great. Yeah, well, as you can imagine, it's different. We work in 8 countries. We've worked in, with different partners, different funders who've had different objectives and criteria and so forth. And so, it varies place to place. But I'll sort of tell you what a typical or default or central scenario might look like for us, which is the, first step in the process is figuring out to whom you want to transfer the money. And then the second step is getting it to them. And that first step involves a fair bit of work and historically a lot of boots on the ground, people going out into communities, finding people that meet criteria, maybe as simple as where you live, right? People who live in poor places, and then making sure that they're registered for mobile money or for whatever digital payment solution we want to use, and that they're able to receive payments. And then second is sort of actually sending the payment, transmitting it through that mechanism. And so the sort of things that have been changing for us in the last couple of years that I think have been very exciting, first with the pandemic, that first step has had to go entirely virtual, right, entirely remote. And we found some really exciting ways to do that. We have this project in Togo, for example, with the government, where it's entirely based on cell phone metadata, analyzed using machine learning algorithms from folks at Berkeley. So some really kind of neat cutting edge stuff, I think, that's being picked up now and used in other places. That's exciting. And then through all of this, we're making a lot of use of the phone, right? So we, the mobile money feature or aspect of this is exciting and the thing that people often think about, but the opportunity to make plain old vanilla phone calls to people and check in and see if they're getting money or if they're having issues or coach them through a problem, things like that, that's really essential too. So, so that's sort of what the nuts and bolts of it look like. And then in terms of, what numbers do we look at? We look at how much of the money actually gets to the people that it's meant to reach, and sort of, one minus that is how much fraud was there, how much corruption. And so, we're proud of that. I think a lot of NGOs, it's a taboo word. It's something they don't like to talk about, or there's this myth that there is no corruption. And, for us, I think we're very open about it. I think some of my best experiences building Give Directly has been to say, it's an issue and we think we're pretty good at dealing with it. The worst cases we've had, we've lost maybe 0.5% of a round of transfers to a fraud incident, but by being very open about that, I think it helps to build trust with people who understand how the real world works. So that's going to be one. We're going to look at sort of recipient comprehension. So one thing we can do in these phone calls is just check if people understand the program and how it works, and if they're satisfied, if they feel like they've been treated respectfully and had things explained to them clearly. So there's sort of a customer service element of this. And what's nice about that is we can feed that back into performance evaluation for our field staff as well, that they're getting measured and monitored on those metrics that we care about. And then, of course, the overall efficiency of it is a big one, right? What share of every dollar that is given to us are we ultimately able to put into people's hands? And so, varies a bit place to place. I think historically, we've typically been able to do about 90% of every dollar. And one thing that we've made a real point of is to be very open with people about the cost structure and not to slip into this world of, don't worry about it because magically somebody else is covering the costs. And so every dollar you give is going to go directly to them. Because I actually think in the long run, it's counterproductive. Like what's helpful is to actually understand the cost of doing stuff and figure out who's good at it and ask if there are ways to make it cheaper and understand, if one place it costs 5% more than another place, and think about whether that's worth paying that additional cost. And so we view that as part of our role.
And I think your point on openness and being as transparent as you can about it is the right way to do it, right? Because that way you can attract probably more partners to partner with you and give you more resources to do more, to give, more direct aid. I do have a question for you.
Let me say one thing about that, if I might, Ibrahim, is just in case there anyone out there that's thinking about getting started or getting started, is I think it's a communication strategy that you have to commit to from the beginning. Because if you don't, if you go for a long time of saying things are good, and then at some point you say, you know what, let's be a bit more open about this, then there's going to be some disappointed expectations and people that feel like you haven't been entirely upfront. So it's one of those choices that you want to make early, not one of those that you want to think about 5 years in.
And I think that's why a lot of nonprofits, fail early on in the stage, right? Because they present to their audience or the people they're catering towards this utopic view of what they're trying to do, and they try to hide some of, some of the aspects of the nonprofit that are not as attractive to people. And in your case, you have not done that, right? You've been as honest as possible, and you've actually been at the forefront of trying to make this field more accessible to people. And I mean, you publish your data online, and it's been really fascinating to look at. But in terms of the long term, if governments start to give UBI more consistently, your organization has been really effective in terms of limiting misuse of those funds. How can governments use some of those same strategies? Do you think it's possible for a big government to even have an effective cost strategy, or do you think that's just these things are just bound to happen in large scale instances of UBI?
Yeah, I mean, there are many that do it and that do it well, and there have been some real remarkable successes during the pandemic, right? Many governments have imposed lockdowns and at the same time recognizing that this is going to cause real economic hardship for people, responded with new cash transfer programs that they've had to spin up very quickly. And the numbers are just staggering. I think it was around 1.2 billion people at the peak that were sort of receiving some incremental cash transfer in the developing world, right, as part of this response. And so, the ability to do that and to do it at scale, and, yeah, it's not perfect. And look, my sort of academic background, a lot of my research is in anti-corruption. And so we work with our partners in government on precisely these problems. But I think a lot of people sort of have this view that NGOs are the ones who do things well and innovatively, and then governments follow. And for some things that's true, but actually with cash transfers, I think it's more been the other way around. It's been governments in the emerging markets who've been the leaders, both in sort of choosing to do this and then in figuring out how to do it. And it's often us, the wealthy donors in the richer countries that are still catching up.
So going back to because this is really interesting. I worked on a project with this in college. And so it seems like because there's a program or a website called Charity Navigator, and they kind of distinguish the good charities from the bad charities per se. And so notably Wounded Warriors project, they're huge, right? And it turns out that they actually have a 70% rate. And it turns out that if you have less than 80%, then there's funneling of cash going somewhere, right? And you guys are under a 98% rate, which is remarkable, and I commend you guys for that, because that truly is great. So what do you think goes on behind closed doors, and how do you think that donors can like fly away from that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So, the way I think about what a site like Charity Navigator can and can't tell you is it provides you this sort of basic first pass of like, is there appropriate accountability and governance structure in place? Right? Are there kind of any sort of real big red flags here where you'd say like, whoa, 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 whoa. And in some cases there are, and so I haven't looked into Wounded Warrior, maybe that's an example of that. And so I think that's a good first thing to do to check before you're, thinking about giving to a nonprofit. What it doesn't tell you is, what impact do the programs actually have? So you could run a completely clean, completely tight organization. There's no money wasted. Everything goes exactly where you say it's going to go. And it just turns out that the thing you're doing isn't all that impactful, right? And so there's nothing dishonest about it. There's nothing fraudulent. It's just not the best use of money. And so I think that's actually the bigger issue. I think that people often, worry about sort of outright fraud or theft in charities. And it's not to kind of, to neglect that issue or to ignore it. But I think that the bigger issue is simply people doing things that are well-intentioned and doing them as they said they would, but not being accountable to any sort of discipline, any accountability to see if it's actually the best thing that we could be doing with the money. Right. And the key difference there is that there's no, not unlike with firms, there's no market test, right? So if you're giving people something for free, it may not be a very good use of money from their point of view, but they're going to take it because it's free. You can't get away with that when you're selling things, right? Because if what you're selling isn't worth what people have to pay for it, no one buys it, you go out of business pretty quickly. No one goes out of business that way in the nonprofit sector. So to me, I think that's actually the bigger issue.
Yeah. I think we talked about a lot of different topics, but one thing I remember you mentioning was automation, and you slightly went over it. But studying artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's when I'm studying that type of stuff, I just see all the possibilities in the future. We're gonna, the world's gonna be entirely different, in my view, and I think that there's gonna be some really negative consequences in the future as a result of machine learning and artificial intelligence, as for like the job market. Do you think there's a solution for that? Do you think UBI is like a solution for that, or do you think there's any other preliminary like steps we could take to prevent any job, help those people out that lose jobs potentially?
Yeah, sure. Let me say a few things quickly. So first, I just in terms of the premise of the question, this isn't something that I do or have looked deeply into. Others have more so than I. Predicting the future is a thankless game, and I've largely limited myself to telling people things that we've already learned and they just hadn't heard about, which is a much easier job. But I'd say that the sort of leading indicators we've seen on this, where people have looked at things like what's happened to labor markets, where there's been greater uptake of industrial robots and automation and things like that. You do see these meaningful impacts on unemployment, underemployment. So to the extent we can see some of these things happening now, it seems like there's probably there. And the second big thing I'd say, and this sort of then ties into well, what do we do about it? Is if you look at the experience with trade and opening up to China, the impact that that's had on our economy, the deindustrialization of the United States, like the places really matter a lot. And one of the things that I think economists were really guilty of, and this isn't original to me, a lot of people think this, is sort of implicitly having in our heads the assumption that if people lost a job in one place, they'd move somewhere else to get a new one, right? So that as long as there are good jobs being created somewhere in the economy, the big picture, things are going to be all right. And it turns out that people don't want to pick up their lives and move across the country to go somewhere else and chase a job, when the place they live is the place that they see as home. And, what they want is actually some vision, some path forward for that place, for that town, for that city, so that people can stay there and still be happy and productive. So, I think that there will maybe a sort of a similar set of issues to think about with automation, as that impacts different parts of the country differently, and to realize that our strategy for dealing with it is going to have to be geographic to some extent. I think the second big thing is, people sort of rightly critique or UBI and say, well, it's fine in terms of sheltering people, or it might not be UBI, but it might be policies that start to look more like UBI, like much more generous and unconditional, compensation to people who lose their jobs, for example. But sort of policies that move us in that direction, they address one part of the issue, which is, livelihoods and being able to support yourself and live with a certain level of dignity. They don't address the issue, which is that, I think most people actually want to do something productive and to be of value to others, even if it's just narrowly within their family or community. And so I don't see UBI as a solution. I don't see it as necessarily an impediment to that, right? So I don't see in the data that sort of idea that people will do less of that because they're getting the UBI. But, there's still this question of what will people do that will sort of give them a sense of self-worth and a contribution, which I think matters a lot as well. So, that's something to keep an eye on in a lot of these early pilots, right, that are happening in the US, is whether you see people, switching into doing things with their time that are perhaps uncompensated, but that still give them a sense of contribution and of dignity and of self-worth. That would be sort of high on my list of things to watch.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. I know you've researched in a lot of different developing nations. Has automation impacted any of those countries severely, or in regarding job loss or any effects on poverty?
No, not really. I mean, really, the concern in a lot of these places is that they've missed the boat in terms of industrialization. That sort of the opportunity to build sort of like capital intensive, relatively low skilled industries and export that stuff to the rich countries, to the rich markets. That's already been seized elsewhere, and the sort of prices have been pushed down so low that there just isn't a meaningful opportunity to do that now in some of these other countries that are kind of developing a bit later. And so the big questions people ask are, is there some way for people to make the leap straight from being, kind of small scale agricultural workers, farmers, into tertiary sectors like services and things like that. Like, what would that even look like? Are we talking about trying to train farmers to become programmers, or, it just seems like a leap too far. So those are the kinds of tough questions people are typically grappling with that are sort of related, I guess, to automation.
And I think that's just something that I think more of the developed countries are going to have to deal with in the future, as opposed to the underdeveloped. I do want to ask you about something you mentioned earlier about the length of these experiments. In cities like Stockton in California, I believe their experiment lasted 2 to 3 years, and obviously they supported a lot of the other conclusions in previous research that people were using the money generally to spend it on necessities, things like groceries, paying their rent, and actually using added money coming in, right? Using that money to find other jobs and getting better jobs in some cases. But we haven't really seen a large scale UBI experiment that extends over the period of, let's say, 10 to 20 years. I mean, the only example I can think of in the United States, at least, is Alaska, right? Where they've been using oil revenues, right, as a way to give around $1,000 or $2,000 annually to every single citizen in Alaska. How do we deal or grapple with that conundrum, in your opinion? Is that because I think on a macro level that is relevant, that we haven't really seen the implications of a UBI over the course of 10 to 20 years on a large scale yet.
Yeah. Well, first, let me just mention and highlight some cool research. In addition to the Alaska case, Alaska obviously wasn't an experiment, but people have done some nice work trying to compare people living in Alaska to hopefully fairly similar people living elsewhere. But, that's a tough exercise, as you can imagine. There has been some really nice work in the US that looks at, and this is going to sound very, very funny and very specific, but it's really quite creative and clever. So it looks at Native American populations when a casino opens up nearby and they start to receive dividend payments from the casino. Because that's part of the way that these deals are structured. And so essentially you have people that are all kind of living in the same neighborhood, and then suddenly some of them, because they happen to have Native American ancestry, start to receive these payments that their neighbors are not. And so you get this relatively clean experiment, right, where you can see what this long-term stream of payments does to those households and their kids and things like that. So we do know a bit from that, but I think that the broad point is still exactly right, that there's sort of very little in the US that goes to these kinds of scales or durations. I think in terms of scale, I don't see it happening, in the sense that there's nothing in the US that's analogous to a village in Kenya, where you could say, let's kind of, everything's a big suburb here, right? So you can't really do the same kind of experiment that we can get away with in Kenya. In terms of duration, though, somebody could totally do it. Somebody could say, we're going to take a bunch of people and commit to giving them a basic income at what we think is sort of the right US number for 10 or 20 years. And, people usually look at that and say, oh, well, but it would cost a lot of money compared to this Kenya project, which is like $40 million or whatever. It costs like multiples of that. And I mean, sure, but like there are lots of people that could write that check. So they should do it.
Yeah, I agree with you that, it's hard to use a similar model across different areas. Like you mentioned, there's different problems in each of these different areas. So you've been conducting the research, at least, and again, we're asking a lot of long-term questions here, but I do have to ask you on a political level. You in the United States, and you mentioned, a lot of people during the pandemic were on receiving some sort of cash transfers. Again, it's hard to predict the future, but do you see UBI as a policy that's here to stay on a political and economic level, or do you think that because one criticism of UBI that I have to mention here is, again, I don't agree with this, but a lot of people say that a lot of big tech companies have been sponsoring a lot of UBI research because they fear that a lot of jobs are going to be lost, and so they have been on the forefront of sponsoring the UBI research, which I think is not a valid argument in my opinion. But sort of looking at it from a political lens, what's your opinion on the practical application of UBI?
Yeah, well, and look, I haven't been deep in the U.S. politics of it. Others have, obviously, but I think first, the first important thing to recognize is that while there is interest on it from a lot of different perspectives and partisan points of view, when rubber hits the road, people are actually talking about somewhat different things. In the sense that on the left, I think there's a lot of interest in this as something that we might do incremental to things that are already being done in terms of social policies, and that we pay for with additional taxes. And it might in fact be taxes on, on the wealthy, taxes on capital, taxes on robots, things like that. On the right, I think there's interest in it, but it's more from the perspective of, skepticism of existing government programs, of the bureaucracy that they entail, of the incentives, the disincentives that they create for people to work. And saying something like this that's unconditional and simple would be more attractive to me. So I'd like to replace the existing safety net with something that looks more like that. And so, sort of ground zero, I think, for a discussion about the politics of this is just recognizing that those are fundamentally very different propositions. And so, there may superficially be bipartisan interest, but at that level, I think there isn't a lot of alignment yet. In terms of what's realistic, I think we're now seeing this movement back towards, in general, more cash-based programming and less conditional programming in the US, which is a swing back from a, sort of a movement in the other direction that perhaps peaked during welfare reform in the 1990s, right, under Bill Clinton, when there was this shift towards more conditionality, more monitoring, more in-kind. I think one of the big interesting things for me is what will be the lasting impacts, if any, of the pandemic on our acceptance of this. In the conversations that I've had with donors, it's been what's made it such a fascinating year is that, first, people have been very generous, which is wonderful and deeply appreciated. Give Directly received more than $300 million last year, largely to help, respond to the pandemic. But second, I think that that's driven by a lot of people recognizing that, hey, people are having a hard time and it's not their fault, right? It was something that was beyond their control. And so I think for me, there's this question of, will the recognition of that extend to other things that are beyond our control, right? Like where you happen to be born, for example, which is also something that we don't have much influence over. And recognize that that's also something that has a profound impact on people's lives, but that they can't change or can't be held responsible for. So, I think that's part of our job now at Give Directly, is to kind of help people to bridge that gap. And, I think politically, that's going to be one of the interesting things to see. Do people take away from this that, boy, sometimes the unthinkable just happens, and we should design policies in a way that anticipates that.
I think it's so fascinating, the thing you mentioned about, the varying differences in how people on the left and the right conceive of a UBI. On the right, I've seen a lot of arguments made primarily by libertarians, where they see UBI as a concept, like you said, right, that replaces the existing welfare and kind of, the government institutes a flat tax and everybody gets some sort of a basic income, but on conditionality. But again, that's not really UBI; it's not universal. And then on the left, it's a completely different argument there. And I think I want to also comment on something you mentioned during the Bill Clinton administration, the welfare program created then. And in my opinion, this conception that those who are impoverished, right, spend money excessively and not on the right things, kind of stemmed in the 1980s. And that sort of welfare, in my opinion, that conception of welfare, that those who are in need of money don't spend it in the right ways, is just misguided. And to me, your research has and others' research has proven that those people who actually need money, they spend money. And what Andrew Yang likes to call this a trickle up economy, where people are constantly spending their money and vitalizing local businesses, etc. And so I think there's going to be a massive change in how people perceive of just basic unconditional payments. We've already seen that most Americans support some sort of a basic income. I think there was a poll done recently where 60 to 70% of Americans were actually for the idea of continuing on the stimulus payments, right, much longer. And that's understandable. But it's fascinating to me that finally, people are starting to understand that people who don't have the right resources, they don't just blow money, they actually utilize that money on basic needs, and that in turn just creates a trickle up economy rather than a trickle down economy, right, where we just stop taxing the rich and we assume that those who are wealthy are going to pay their fair share or stimulate the economy. So I think I just want to make a comment.
Yeah, and here's, I think that's right. And here's the thing that would be very interesting that I haven't seen. I don't know if you have, or if the polling that you mentioned spoke to it, which is, I think there are actually two very distinct doubts or concerns that people have about, government helping folks when they're having a hard time. I think one is the concern that, if we give them too much freedom over what kind of help it is, if we give them money and let them, as you say, that they may spend it on the wrong things. But another is that, if we promise to help people, then they're not going to do as much to help themselves in the first place, whether we're giving them money, food, whatever it is that we're giving them, right? And I think that concern, right, that we're sort of going to bail people out who weren't willing to do the hard work and make the effort to look after themselves. If anything, I think that's maybe the bigger one. And so I'd be very interested to see sort of polling on UBI that gets separately at these two different, I think, kind of core doubts, fears, mistrust people have about social insurance, and sort of how UBI is resonating with people on those two dimensions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, during the simulation checks, did your organization see any increase in donations or decrease, or was there any correlation between when the pandemic was happening and the amount of donations you guys were receiving?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this briefly, but it was a massive year for Give Directly. We Give Directly was received over $300 million in 2020, which is multiples of what we had done the previous year. And so and that's clearly and unambiguously because of the pandemic response work that we were doing. A bit less than half of that went to programming in Africa that we ran. A bit more than half of that went to programming in the US, which we stood up for the first time, right? We had done a few one-off projects in the US before, but last year was the first time that we built anything that was sustained or of this magnitude in the US. And by the way, credit to the team because they stood this up in the course of about 10 days, from kind of initial inception to having something ready. So that was a really exciting experience.
Yeah, and just one more follow-up question. Do you guys, from your data, how do you guys kind of quantify social changes? So like, for example, do you guys quantify happiness or satisfaction or any of these like more unquantifiable metrics in your guys' researches or from your data? Do you guys do that or?
Yeah. Well, generally our approach to this has been that we don't, as an organization, have a definition of like what the right outcomes are, where we'd say, success is seeing this metric go up by this much per dollar. Rather, our view has been that, we're committed to rigorous evaluation in the sense that it's going to be credible and we can say with confidence that these are the average effects that this program's having. And we'll try to look at a pretty broad array of outcomes typically so that, you can then look at them and say, here's what I think of that. Here's how I feel about that as a donor. And partly that's because we want to provoke this conversation of like, what is success actually? And if different people have a different view of it, if some people are doing one thing, some people are doing another thing, how do we feel about that as donors? So, that list of things that we look at often does include, when we run an experiment, it often does include a lot of these more subjective measures of well-being and of happiness. What we typically are going to do there is use standard scales that other social scientists use. So for example, there are measures of depression that are standard. They're used in a lot of research and also used for clinical diagnosis, like the CESD scale. So we'll use things like that. We'll use other concepts from psychology like locus of control or aspirations, things like that. I think these things are imperfect. And, especially in the UBI project, I think where we have some time to really think and talk to people about how they perceive success and a good life. I'd like for us to be innovative there and think of even better things we can do. But I think this gives us a pretty comprehensive picture, surely as comprehensive as we have for any other kind of intervention that we have out there, sort of what's happening to people's psychological, emotional, social lives as a result of the transfers.
And I think as you collect more data, you'll probably have a better understanding of these different metrics. On that note, I think we talked about a lot of issues and topics. Thank you so much for being so kind and answering our different variety of questions. We appreciate your time and best of luck to you in the research you're doing. And we just really want to thank you for the work that Give Directly has done, because I really do think that you guys have started a movement, I would say, of these cash transfers and of large amounts of money being given directly to people. And we're seeing the positive repercussions of that. So appreciate you.
Hey, man, thank you. It was a lot of fun to hang out with you guys. And, just in general, it was fun, good energy, enjoyed the questions, on point. But also, I think the reality is that a lot of stuff like this changes slowly and changes generationally. There's this famous book about how things change in science. You'd think that scientists would be among the quickest, the most evidence-based and fact-based and the quickest to adopt good new ideas when they come along. It turns out it's often the old guys who did it the old way die, and the young guys pick up the flag and do it the new way. So I think a lot of this stuff is going to be that way as well. And so it's really fun to get to talk to you guys about it.
Of course, that's our goal here, just to, kind of open up the minds of new listeners and see if they're willing to adapt to a new ideology. So I commend you guys on everything.
Thanks, Matt.